Well, we're sticking to the gospel today. We have a reading from the Gospel of Mark. Mark 4, verses 26 through 34. Jesus also said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle because the harvest has come." Jesus also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it?" And Jesus said, "It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." With many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. Jesus did not speak to them except in parables, but Jesus explained everything in private to his disciples. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The farmers market in Charleston is open 7 days a week. It's quite nice, and it's pretty big. And it's filled with potential, overflowing with beauty and groaning in abundance. Everything there looks so perfect, and I go and I buy, hoping that I can bring that perfection home. The seeds that were scattered months ago were tended in the greenhouses of, here are some names up my way: the Grits, the Bostics, the Evans, the Cavenders, Roan Grown from Roan County, Debbie from Debbie's Corner, and the other vendors and growers represent each plant, each vegetable, each shrub, tree, and perennial being sold at the market. The sowers have sown, and the time to reap has come. So I've been to the market several times to buy flowers and herbs for our front porch and to hang on the pergola on the side of our house. And one of the best parts of the day is watering the plants and picking off the spent blooms and removing dead leaves and applying some I just found out about some really good plant food and petunia food. I didn't know you could get a specific combination for petunias, so they're doing great, and it's a miracle because usually they just die on me. They're just producing great results, and staying on top of this is critical. It's critical to the success of the plants, and it's also critical that I am vigilant against the deer who view my yard as their personal smorgasbord. I lost a beautiful hosta a few days ago, and then one last night, and I'm pretty sick about it. But the deer have to eat too, I guess. But in addition to the feeling of peace that gardening gives, there's a tangible reward for the labor put in. And it's an easy formula in a straight line from planting to watering and feeding to blooming. What comes with the reward, though, is also the feeling that I have to stay in control of what's happening at all times, or what is planted will be lost. The feeling of peace can give way to anxiety and even fear. Am I doing this right? Am I doing enough? And what will happen if I fail? Well, our gospel lesson today gives us a completely different point of view on the gardener and on gardening. Jesus is teaching in parables, as he does, and in today's passage we heard two. The Reverend Debbie Thomas puts the two parables in these two boxes. One, in the first parable, Jesus offers his listeners a gardener who scatters seed on the ground and then goes off to sleep. The seeds fend for themselves, or as our gospel writer Mark puts it, the earth produces of itself. And when the grain is ripe, the gardener harvests it. In the second parable, someone sows a tiny mustard seed in the ground, and it grows into a gigantic bush, so large it can offer birds shelter in its branches. Jesus intends to show us what the kingdom of God looks like through these two parables. But how? Nothing about the face value of either of these parables makes much sense. Reverend Thomas believes they're intended to stretch our imaginations far beyond any place we would take them on our own. What is the kingdom of God like? Are you sure you want to know? Okay. The kingdom of God is like a sleeping gardener. Mysterious soil, an invasive weed, and a nuisance flock of birds. So first, the gardener. Who is this person who throws out a bunch of seeds and then takes a nap for the rest of the growing season? Where is the meticulous planner, the planter, making perfect rows, protecting the young plants in a hothouse or surrounded by a fence? Where is the worrier who watches the weather and irrigates when necessary? Who is doing the fertilizing, the pruning, and the weeding? Where is the daily grind of dealing with the garden? The gardener in Jesus' parable enjoys the rest that comes from believing in a process that is ancient, mysterious, cyclical, and certain. The gardener trusts the seeds, trusts the soil, trusts the sun, the shade, the clouds, the rain. Yes, the gardener participates in the process by planting and harvesting, by paying attention to the seasons, by getting to work when the time is ripe. But the gardener never harbors the illusion that he's in charge, because he knows that he's operating in the realm of mystery. Jesus is telling us that in this story, the kingdom, it is not, in this story of the kingdom, it is not our striving, our piety, our good works, or our impressive prayers that cause us to grow and thrive in God's garden. It is not those things. It is one thing. It is God's grace alone. It is God's grace alone. And then there's the soil in which Jesus' parable is powerful, fruitful, and fertile, but it's also hidden and mysterious, doing its work underground, deep beneath the surfaces where we can't see what it's doing. Of course, we know that the soil eventually brings forth abundance, but the process of bringing forth all the nitty-gritty details we long to dissect and master, those details are hidden from our eyes. If anything, Reverend Thomas says, we live in that disconcerting time between planting and harvest. We look outside and we see nothing but dark earth, and then the fragile shoots. We see vast expanses of hope, longing, love, and uncertainty, deep desire, and delicate potential. In the garden of our own lives, we struggle constantly, planting prayers, but then refusing to let them rest and germinate in God's care. We mistake our refusal with the vigilance, wisdom, and caution of responsible adulthood. But Thomas tells us that in Jesus' gardening metaphor, that inability to step back and let God do the work is a form of faithlessness and even a kind of futile attempt to play God. Now, in the second parable, Jesus tells us that a gardener intentionally plants a mustard seed into the ground. And the joke here is that not only are the seeds tiny, but the people in Jesus' day didn't plant mustard seeds because mustard was a noxious and stubborn weed. And if anyone were foolish enough to plant it, it would quickly take over the land, sowing its own seeds, dropping them everywhere, and breaking down all the barriers of separation between itself and the other plants in the garden. Just imagine a gardener today deliberately planting kudzu or bittersweet vines. These are commonplace nuisances that we try to get rid of, not plants we cultivate on purpose. But the mustard seed grows from the smallest of all the seeds on earth and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. So consider this. What is Jesus saying when Jesus describes the sacred and the holy as a tiny, insignificant mustard seed? What does it mean to take an invasive, spindly weed, a plant we'd sooner discard than sow, and make it the very heart, the very structural center of God's kingdom? I don't think it's a coincidence that the speaker of this parable, Jesus Christ himself, comes to earth as a tiny and forgettable mustard seed. A little backwater baby who's born into poverty, born at the edge of a vast empire. Or that the people who first follow Jesus when he grows up are a bunch of raggedy fishermen and corrupt tax collectors. They're clueless, clumsy, timid, and doubtful. Is it really the case that God's kingdom rests on people like these? Yeah, absolutely it does. Now, we may struggle to sleep in God's care because we simply discount, ignore, and overlook what seems too insignificant for our attention. That little mustard seed, well, nobody wants that. But I like to think about little tiny toddlers when they first learn to walk, and they walk around exploring the world. They see the smallest things, and they find beauty and value in a little pebble or a tiny weedy flower or even a piece of trash. But to their eyes, the pebble and the weedy flower and the trash merit attention. The child lifts each thing up to her parent in delight and wonder. And I think we sometimes look at people and even ourselves as the weedy flowers and the trash. There are hundreds of homeless people begging on the streets, unwashed, addicted, desperate. But there are also people in beautiful homes who are addicted and desperate, unwashed spiritually. But God sees us all, where we are, what we are, and who we are, through the eyes that He gives the toddler. God carefully chooses each of us, even when we're at our worst, and sees us as beautiful, valuable, and worthy of love. In the last part of today's parables, we have an image of this giant weedy mustard plant and of the birds of the air making nests in its shade. Now, for bird lovers, this seems quite wonderful. A beautiful image of lovely songbirds, but to the gardener, this is a disaster. Birds eat seeds. Birds take one bite out of your tomato, and then leave it. Birds can destroy a cornfield. Birds are the reason farmers put up scarecrows. But Reverend Thomas says Jesus is not a scarecrow kind of gardener, because the kingdom of God is all about welcoming the unwelcome, sheltering the unwanted, practicing radical inclusion. The garden of God doesn't exist for itself. It exists to offer nourishment to everyone the world deems unworthy. It exists to attract and to house the very people we'd rather shun. Its primary purpose is hospitality, not productivity. Think of the garden with the giant mustard plant filled with birds. Think of your own garden. Think of your community. And think of the church. How many times have we shooed the birds away because we're so busy policing our gardens? Whose needs, hungers, and hopes have we ignored because our eyes are locked on the ground of our own efforts, intentions, priorities, and strategic plans? How many times have we shooed birds away because it's just too hard to look at them, too hard to accept them? The kingdom of God is a garden that grows slowly, that is mysterious. The fruit it bears begins out of our sight and out of our control. There are even long and short periods when the ground is completely fallow. In God's garden, there are plants we don't recognize. There are plants we don't want to see. There are plants we can neither control nor contain. But friends, in God's garden, we're simply asked to do what we can do and then rest. Just rest. And even though this is good news, because it is good news, resting in God's grace through Jesus Christ, it isn't always easy. The truth is, it hurts to surrender our creative imagination and need to control God's expansive, life-changing care. It hurts to loosen our grip, to trust, to accept mystery, to seek God in the commonplace and to embrace the unwanted thing as beloved. Because we're made in God's image, we have a share in creation. God's grace gives us the opportunity to plant, to tend, and to reap. God's grace also requires that we extend grace to the weeds, to the birds, even to the trash. God's grace allows us to find a haven of rest. God's grace allows us to let go, to trust that the God of the inscrutable seed is also the God of the magnificent harvest. Thanks be to God.